Welcome to our next video. This is going to provide you with some background information about the book of Numbers, which describes the wilderness wanderings of God's people. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is from a discussion that I led a few years ago and is edited to provide you with the essential content to help you better understand what is going on in these significant chapters. So let's begin. So Numbers, as we enter it, it's them moving towards the promised land. So I want to first show you the places, because to understand Numbers is to look at this map. It's really a travel log. And so you can see that green line kind of generally showing where they had the Exodus, moving from Egypt down to the Mount Sinai at the point of that landmass in the middle. And so from Mount Sinai, you see in red how they started to move up the Gulf, and then they started kind of wandering in the wilderness of Paran. And so instead of going to the promised land, we'll talk about this, they didn't have faith. And so God said that generation won't enter the promised land. And so they wandered. And then the last place, so it goes from Mount Sinai to Paran to Moab, which is just to the east of Israel. You can see the Dead Sea there, and it's just to the east of that. So that's the places that we've been reading about. And then in terms of the characters, you're going to start to see a lot of people groups mentioned. So we're moving beyond just names of people. And so I wanted to just kind of highlight where these people groups have come from. You can see this on the screen. And so there's a few that I just want to highlight that you've read about. So the Ammonites, that was a people group that came from Lot. And you remember that in Genesis 19. And so in our story in Numbers, they received a land grant from the Lord to support Israel. You see that in Deuteronomy 2. Now, they're going to eventually become a problem. They're going to oppress Israel for 18 years in Judges. They threatened Israel until Saul defeated them in 1 Samuel. But they start out being part of the family and then really kind of oppose Israel. The Moabites are in the same boat as them, the Ammonites. They also received a land grant to support Israel, Deuteronomy 2. And then they're the group that hired Balaam to curse Israel in Numbers 22 to 24. They also seduced Israel to do things contrary to God's will. We see that in Numbers 25. They also oppressed Israel. So you kind of see this kind of pattern. They're also the people group through which we're going to meet Ruth later on. And so they're coming out of that group. The Midianites, they're a son of Abraham. You can see that on the far right. Abraham through Keturah had the Midianites. So that's a son of Abraham, Genesis 25. They're connected to the Moabites, where we are introduced to a woman in Numbers 31 who is so connected to the Moabites. It's like they're grouped into how they're not a group that God wants them to be influenced by. And so the Midianites, though, we see them again in Judges with Gideon. So they also oppose Israel. There's two more groups I want to mention. The Edomites, that's remember Esau, Jacob's brother, in Genesis 25. They also received a land grant to support Israel. They refused passage in Numbers 20. So you just see a lot of just kind of hostility. It's not easy, even though they're linked to Abraham. Even so, it creates problems for Israel. The last group that's not on here that I just want to mention are the Amorites, and they're the Canaanites. And so that's back in Genesis 10. We're introduced to Ham, the son of Noah, and so they're descendants of Ham, who was highlighted at that time, the brief introduction, that he had the sin of voyeurism. So the Canaanites are going to become really the group of people that Israel is going to defeat to live in the promised land. So we'll talk more about that. But we do read in Leviticus 18 how they became morally corrupt. For example, they were practicing child sacrifices. And so God didn't want them to be influencing Israel. And so when the Amorites filled up to the measure of their sin, which was prophesied 400 years earlier in Genesis 15, God was hoping for repentance. He gave them time. He was patient with them, but they did not change. And so God brought Joshua and the children of Israel against them. And so the conquest of Canaan served the dual purpose of punishing the Amorites for 400 years of just refusal to turn to God. So there's punishment, and then it's also giving the Israelites a land for their own. So that's kind of the characters. Let's look at the timeline. And so again, there's 3 places that develops this. And then after the timeline, we'll just kind of talk about the plot in a couple moments and then talk through this. But just to kind of set the stage, because it kind of runs through as a travel log, it can be hard to follow. And so the story picks up from Leviticus with Moses entering God's presence, which gives hope for God's people that despite their failure, sin can be covered so that God can dwell with them in peace. And so now God's people still need a place to dwell. So Numbers is this travel log from Sinai to the promised land. You'll see it divided by 3 stops. Starts with Sinai, where they organize, goes to Paran, the wilderness, and then to Moab, right near the promised land. So chapters 1 to 10, that's the organization. So we didn't read that part. It's largely just describing the groups of people. But notice that God's presence is in the center of camp. He's leading them. And so then in chapter 10, they leave to go to Paran, where the spies are sent out to report on the land. However, the people do not believe God's promise. So this is the generation that's not allowed to enter the land. And they wander for 40 years as a result. Then the third place is the end of the book, 21 to 36. They arrive in Moab, near the promised land, and you begin to see this glimmer of hope. The prophet Balaam, he can only bless God's people, which not only surprises the king of Moab, who's concerned about Israel, doesn't know that he can defeat them, so sends Balaam to curse them. But the reader, we're wondering, God's people, they're wandering through this barren land because of their rebellious attitude and continued disobedience, and yet it seems like God's involved protecting them. And so the general plot for Numbers is, amidst their rebellion, God keeps providing for them. And so a contrast that's going to be told and retold again and again to learn from. God is faithful to his promises and allows his people to experience the consequences of their actions. And so that's what happens. They didn't trust God. And so we learn when God's people do not follow his lead on his journey, they miss out, and they miss out on experiencing the fullness of God's blessing in their lives. Now, I want to highlight 2 chapters that are really the turning points of this book, and then let's take some time to talk through this. And so the 2 key parts is Numbers 14 and then Numbers 20. So Numbers 14, this is when the spies are sent out and they learn that the land that they're going to dwell in is incredible, but the people resist. And the Lord said, "How long will the people spurn me? Will they not believe me?" And so that's a radical turn of faith in the story for God's people who rejected what God promised them. And it resulted in one whole generation dying in the wilderness. And you wonder why. That seems extreme. Well, look at the progression. Let's give it a little recap. A progression of faith. So this is a theme that was introduced with Abraham that really picks up again in Exodus 4. And it's really moving from faith as a model in Abraham to now faith as a people, as Israel. And so we see that first in Exodus 4, Moses gave signs to the people and they believed. So that's a positive example of faith, a good start. And then we see that theme of faith again next in Exodus 14. The people saw the great hand of the Lord and they believed. So another positive example of faith. And then next is Numbers 14, which became unbelief. So that was a negative statement of faith. So you start to see that radical turn from believing, contrary to all the things that God has done, they can't trust him. And so their unbelief opposes God's plan. That's the problem. And so for God, it's no different than the Egyptians. He even calls them wicked in verse 35, which is akin to the Egyptians. So their unbelief stalls their journey of faith, which is the key turning point in Numbers for God's people. So in chapter 14, verses 30 to 34, because of their fear for what would happen to their families, now their children will suffer by wandering for them for 40 years. But it is only their parents who will die in the wilderness and not experience the blessing. And so that's a huge turning point, just that progression of fear or progression of faith stalled. And so then they receive the consequence of their lack of belief. But it's not just the people. And the next turning point, and then let's talk through this, is Numbers 20. Moses is told to speak to the rock, and he struck the rock instead. Now, he struck the rock before, and that was what God said, but this time is to speak to the rock. He out of anger struck the rock. And so because of his lack of faith, now he is also not allowed to the promised land. Well, why? Well, you can see the deterioration of Moses' faith as early as chapter 11. That's really, Numbers becomes a real conflicted story. And chapter 11, that's when he's no longer standing for God's people. And it even says that he seeks suicide in verse 15. So Moses is at a kind of an extreme ending point. He wants to be done with it all. But he's not done. And so important to see in chapter 11 is how Moses believed what was needed at this point was God's Spirit to come down and empower them. He said in verse 29 that he wished all of God's people would be empowered by God's Spirit, not just him. So that's kind of a foreshadowing what's going to happen later on in the Bible with the Spirit coming down on the church. But the point is that we're seeing a shift from looking to Moses to looking for something greater than Moses. And so as we come to chapter 20, we learn that even Moses is unable to enter the land. And Moses, who is the ideal representative, a model for God's people, who shows us what it looks like to speak with and for God to the world, even Moses is not the answer. And so this point is amplified with Aaron's death. That's his right-hand man, who also failed like Moses and did not experience God's blessing either. All of this confirms that the calling of faith, which began with Abraham, is still the faith required to move God's people forward on their journey, which is the book of Numbers. And so because without faith, God's people will not be led by God and resist his plan for them. And so the wilderness becomes this real refining fire for God's people to grow and mature their faith in God before they enter the promised land. And so